Alright, hey folks, this is Keough, and I haven't done a video log in a long time, so I figured I would mess around and do one today, and do one in response to a question that was posed recently on a forum that I frequent, and it's an interesting question. And the question is, what separates a beginning lifter from an intermediate lifter and from an advanced lifter? And if you Google search this, you will find a couple of different responses, a few different responses that the people have traditionally employed to explaining the difference between the two. And so one really commonly used way of differentiating between beginner, intermediate, and advanced lifter is to use some sort of weight standard, so a performance-based weight-lifted standard. So you'll find a number of charts online that will separate beginners from intermediates from advanced lifters. And so if you're, say, like me, a 148-pound lifter, you might see a standard that says, okay, to have a beginning level deadlift, you need to be able to pull 250 pounds, and to be intermediate level, you have to pull 330, and to be advanced, you have to pull 380, and to be elite or whatever, you have to pull 460, 470. I'm just sort of making the numbers up. The numbers are arbitrary. I'm just using it as an example to show one way in which people define and delineate the divisions between these three categories: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And so that's one way. And the other way that I oftentimes see these categories being delineated is by talking about the amount of experience that someone has. So a lot of people like to say that in your first year of training, you're a beginner, and then in your second year and your third year, or however long, you are an intermediate lifter, and then at some point you are an advanced lifter. And there's this reminds me of that old maxim that in order to be an expert in a field, you have to spend something like 10,000 or 20,000 or however many thousand hours, a lot of thousands of hours, in order to become an expert in that field. And so the premise there is that strength training is no different, that powerlifting is no different, and after you accumulate a certain number of time handling a barbell for your squat, bench press, and deadlift, you advance to an advanced stage. And so those are two different criteria, and I kind of disagree with both of those. I think that they can indicate, they can give some indication to what category you fall into, but I think in these instances, correlation does not necessarily equal causation. And while these are good indicators of the level you've achieved, whether beginner, intermediate, or advanced, they're not great ones. They're not exactly the one that I would use. And the one that I would use is I would look at the actual performance of the lifter. And here's how I define the difference between beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And perhaps this helps you define for yourself where you stand in your lifting trajectory. So there are two types of lifters, okay, and they're on either ends of the spectrum, who will, when failing a lift, will fail it without any sort of breakdown, okay? There's no sort of technical breakdown in which compensation, or what we call compensation. Compensation just means one muscle group steps in to work harder for another failing or weaker muscle group over the course of the eccentric or concentric phase of a compound movement. There are only two groups in which a lifter will fail a max or a near max movement with no technical breakdown, okay? And one is a really experienced advanced lifter. If you watch a lot of the really top advanced lifters, their technique is so precise, there's very little breakdown, even on near max or max attempts. And if you watch, not to be one of these guys that oversells the IPF, but if you watch a lot of the top lifters in the IPF, their max or their near max lifts look very similar to their warm-ups. And that's the hallmark of a really experienced lifter. And so when a really experienced lifter fails a lift, they just flat out fail the lift more often than not. Okay, there's no breakdown and compensation process that takes place. The same can be said of an absolute beginner. Okay, and a beginner is defined by the lack of development across the board. Okay, in terms of all of their muscle groups. Okay, so a beginner does not have weakness. Okay, a beginner does not have weaknesses. A beginner is just plain weak. Okay, and so with a beginning lifter, what you'll find is anybody that performs a compound movement and has not yet developed certain strengths to compensate for weaknesses, well, they have no weaknesses then, and that's what defines them as being a beginning lifter. A beginning lifter is not going to possess three qualities that will be found to a certain extent in intermediate lifters and found in spades in advanced lifters. All right, and those qualities I refer to as technical proficiency, technical efficiency, and rate of force development. Rate of force development's an easy one to define. It's pretty regularly cited in literature on strength training, and it just refers to the amount of speed, or really the amount of force, but translated in terms of the amount of speed that you produce on the concentric portion of your lift. So how quickly can you develop force? How quickly can you take that bar, which is in an isometric phase at the bottom portion of a movement, and put it in motion again? Lifters who are beginning lifters are not going to be necessarily fast. Okay, they don't know how to produce force quickly. Their bodies don't understand how to do that. They don't understand what it feels like yet to accelerate through a movement. They will also not be technically proficient, nor will they be technically efficient. All right, technical efficiency refers to anything from the motor patterns that you develop, those motor patterns being efficient, being the most efficient way to move a barbell from point A to point B. Within that, as a subcategory, it can refer to your bar path. It can refer to the amount of unnecessary movement that you eliminate from your compound movements. It can refer to, say, how you walk out your squats, even something as simple as that. So all of those different variables factor into what I'm referring to as technical efficiency. And the more experienced you are as a lifter, generally the more efficient you are as a lifter. Lifters at the top move weights in a very efficient manner. They don't have the margin of error to be inefficient with their motor patterns. And beginning lifters aren't going to be technically proficient. Okay, and technical proficiency, just in how I'm using it, refers to your ability to perform a lift repetitively in the same manner. Okay, whether that's correct or incorrect, there are no ingrained motor patterns for beginning lifters. They're not even at a point where they have bad habits yet. Okay, they have no habits. Their corporeal processes as they perform a movement have not yet been habituated. Every rep looks different. Okay, that's an easy way to determine a beginning from an intermediate lifter. If every rep looks different, chances are you're dealing with a beginner. If there are other hallmarks of a beginner, beginners don't even understand how to, say, strain through a lift. They don't even have the physiological awareness to understand what a sticking point is and what it means to work through or try to accelerate through that sticking point. So lifters who are beginning lifters, you see them fail lifts and they just sort of flop down. They don't understand what it means like to strain through a lift because their bodies haven't been accustomed to that process yet. Intermediate lifters I define as being the very large majority of us who have weaknesses. okay, we either have weaknesses in terms of individual muscle groups, okay, so we have weaker muscle groups that have developed disproportionately or in disharmony with stronger muscle groups. So let's say I start squatting. I squat over a period of time. My technique isn't perfect because nobody's technique is perfect early on. Eventually, technical issues emerge that have to be fixed. And let's say just as a for instance, I have weak abductors and my knees cave in on my squats. And as I get stronger and as that load increases, I develop that weakness, okay? Because my abductor strength, because I'm making those technical mistakes, isn't being developed or worked on at the same rate as everything else, okay? Even if my abductors are stronger than they were when I started as an absolute beginner, they have not improved at the same rate as all of my other muscle groups, okay? And that has changed how I perform that lift. I have to compensate for this weak muscle group, all right? So weakness is sorry for the philosophy here, but weakness is, it's a negative term, meaning it's defined through negation, okay? So weakness we defined as not strong, all right? In order for weakness to exist, you have to have strength. Because weakness signifies a lack of strength. And in order for a lifter to have a weakness, that could be a weakness in a muscle group. It could also be a weakness in their strength curve. So a sticking point is an indication of an intermediate level. In order for a lifter to have a weakness, that lifter has to have a strength, okay, to accompany that weakness, right? There have to be strengths to balance out those weaknesses. And so virtually all of us, I guess, are intermediate lifters at some end on the spectrum, and we're all defined by the fact that we have specific weaknesses that need to be addressed, right? And over the process of getting stronger, we address those weaknesses, we work on them, we develop them, and once those weaknesses cease to have a noticeable effect on our training and on our performance of max or near max attempts, that's an indication that we've reached an advanced stage. So an advanced lifter would be somebody who is fast on their lifts, okay, who has exhibited excellent rate of force development, is technically proficient in the ways that I described, and technically efficient in the ways that I described. And if you think about it, there aren't too many advanced lifters out there. And if you watch even a lot of really high-level lifters, a lot of high-level lifters do a lot of things wrong. And like I'm an example of somebody who puts up pretty good numbers, but I make a lot of mistakes in my lifts, and I have a lot of very obvious weaknesses, and that's what makes me still an intermediate level lifter, okay? Beginning, intermediate, and advanced, those should be used as terms to denote a relationship to one's hypothetical ceiling. So when I say that I'm an intermediate lifter, and I'm an intermediate lifter because I have weaknesses, I say that because hypothetically, if I improve those weaknesses, all right, if I develop them, then I will ascend, my lifting will go from here to here, okay, because I have things that I can work on. And that's what puts me at an intermediate stage. So beginner, intermediate, advanced, I use those terms to denote one's relationship to one's hypothetical ceiling. So for an advanced lifter, they are pretty close to their ceiling because they don't have these easy fixes. They don't have the weaknesses that they can address that, say, an intermediate lifter can address. So you can be a world-class lifter. You can be putting up world record caliber numbers and still be considered intermediate level within this paradigm if you have serious deficiencies either in your technique or muscular weaknesses or whatever, that if you work on them and you develop them, will make you stronger. Anyway, I hope that helps. I hope that's interesting. I hadn't done a video log in a while, so I figured I'd throw it out there at you. So anyway, if you're interested in talking about it further, post some comments. I'll be happy to respond.